Greetings. Welcome, everybody. This is The Old School with Dr. Stephen Bourgeois and Ross Miller, coming at you live from our various intellectual epicenters in our various own houses. The Old School podcast dealing with educational issues, available on some of the platforms that you listen to your podcast on. Good morning, Dr. Bourgeois. How's it going?
Mr. Miller, I'm fine. I think last episode I was a little grumpy. Still kind of in the grumpy mood, but maybe you're grumpier than I am. I hope so.
I don't know. It's light outside. Last time, if you recall, it was kind of a late night. It was kind of like one of those old time radio shows that came on like at 2 a.m. and talked about UFOs. You know, it's kind of like that sort of vibe. And then, but now it's light. It's daytime. We're out in the legitimacy of the morning day, and so perhaps this will be a better one.
Better one?
Well, I'm not saying that the last one wasn't good. Well, no, I'm not saying that the last one was bad. I'm just saying perhaps you will feel better. You said you were feeling a little cranky last time.
I was, as I occasionally do.
Yes.
So what are we talking about on this early morning?
We're talking about students. We have a lot to talk about with regards to students. And it could be one of those things where we talk for a certain amount of time and then we think to ourselves, this really needs to be like a 10-part episode, you know, because there's so many things to unravel with regards to students. But I think the first thing we talk about was the idea of like intellectual stamina, attention span, things of that nature, kind of looking at maybe how students have changed, or maybe they haven't changed. Maybe it's just us who have changed.
We almost need to look at ourselves as students. I mean, we've both had our share of, being, on the other side of the desk, I guess.
Sure.
And, I think going back to, I don't remember a lot about elementary or middle school. I think I was just terrified and terribly shy and didn't want to be called on. I wanted it to go away. And when I got to high school, I was terribly shy and wanted it to go away also. So it was no question about stamina or engagement. I just wanted it to go away without incident. And honestly, I've had, 13, 14 years of college, if you add it all up. Mm-hmm. I think I broke the 500-hour mark or something. But during that time, for most of it, I wanted it to go away also. It wasn't until the doctoral courses where I became confident and that I didn't want it to go away, but I wanted to have conversations. But that took a long time,
So you're saying prior to your doctorate, your academic career was one filled with insecurity and a lack of confidence.
I was terrified. Let's back up. My master's degree was in German literature, and I was one of about 2 American students. The rest were native Germans. And my language ability was pretty good, but not good enough. And so it was a struggle. And that really continued. And if I go backwards, I liked the time by myself, in the library, and I did engage with the material, but class was something to put behind me so I could do my real work.
Do you remember elementary, middle school, things like that?
It wasn't that. You're acting like I'm really, really old here. But
I asked because one of my wife's biggest discontents is I do not recall very much my elementary years. I remember a handful of things about elementary school. There was a mean teacher. There was a hot teacher that had a Corvette. I thought that was pretty cool.
You can't say hot anymore, Ross.
I can't?
No.
Well, she's probably not hot now anyway, so it doesn't matter. But so there's the mean teacher. Well, hopefully she's still with us. There was the mean teacher, the hot teacher with a Corvette, the best friend. And then in the second grade, a girl named Paige Moody, who I proposed to with a mood ring. I thought it was clever because her name was Moody. It was a mood ring. And it always had the right colors when I gave it to her. So I just assumed we were meant to be together. And really, that's about the extent of my knowledge and remembrance of elementary school.
That was it. And you're not going to complete the story about Miss Moody.
Well, she accepted, but then her family moved away. So what are you going to do?
I don't know.
Life's full of disappointment.
Well, so we're saying we don't remember our early years very much.
I certainly don't. But I do recall in high school, I had the sense that whatever school was, it wasn't necessarily for me. because it was about trying to get through it. It was about trying to make sure I didn't fail anything, so I didn't have to repeat anything. And by the time I was a junior, I was already mentally headed for the military. And so it just wasn't something that I was keen on. And so I think from both of our points of view, it is strange to sit here and try to assess students who are perhaps in some degree not unlike us when we were students.
Right, and I complain about students who are grade mongers who monitor their GPA every day on tables and charts, and but when I was in middle school, one of my academic memories was a social studies class. Really, it was a class in map making, and that's well before computers, so you literally had to draw the maps, and it was a really good geography course. I mean, we learned a lot. But for me, it was all about the grade. And this teacher had a policy where he allowed extra credit. And so you take tests, you participate, but if for every map you made, you'd get some extra credit.
Okay.
There was no cap on it. And so I took it, quite seriously. And he, back then you could put grades in the classroom. So you had the student and a little chart, a little number, and it could show, the future Dr. Bourgeois well above 100 and above everybody in the class, like at about 132, because I would just sit down and make freaking maps all day. And
you're trending upward. You were trending upwards.
I was, but and I guess I learned the abbreviations of the states and where they were by making those maps. But I was all about the grade, and I'm just the kind of student that I complain about now.
Yeah, I think we're allowed to criticize this because we have grown, we have matured, we've been exposed to different ideas and ways of doing things. I think in critiquing the student today, it is not a critique of the student themselves, but a critique of the system that encourages what the students are holding dear and what they are valuing, because it's based on what they're told to value.
So the teacher has some effect on the attitude of the student with respect to grades or attention or all of that. So we're still always talking about teachers to some extent.
The teachers, the administration, counseling, parents. I think there's a lot of moving parts here that we consider. Okay. And then there are some elements of the modern day student that is affected by technology. And, one of the things we talked about was the idea of attention span and things of that nature. And so I think it's important to consider when we talk about students, we are talking about a much larger contextual understanding of how these students got to be where they are, how they got to value what they value, and their deficiencies as students are, again, things that are impacting them from outside of their realm and making them, having these issues academically in our classrooms.
Well, you could imagine teaching a class of, say, 25, but realistically, you're teaching 3 or 4 who are engaged in the discussion.
Right.
Some are looking for ways to distract themselves, and others, they may want to take a walk, kind of like you do from faculty meetings, but you see that.
Yes.
The thing I never liked was the pencil sharpener, because students would get up, and that's when they had electric ones or the hand one. It didn't matter. It was just as annoying.
Yes.
And I was a very patient teacher, and I wait for that sound. And then the student would say, okay, I'm going to keep going. So by the time they came back, they had a very short pencil, and no jokes there. And I was kind of annoyed, but you had to sit through it. Eventually I got ahead of that and made a policy about that. But I think the point is that you have some students who are right with you, actively engaged, others who are trying to, avoid it or actually entertain themselves other ways. And then there's that whole group in the middle, and maybe we can talk about that group in the middle.
What are we doing to make the situation with those kiddos worse? The old joke that you get the students you deserve, you get the children you deserve as a parent. What are we doing to undermine those middle kids, that larger group, their efforts in our classroom?
I think it's almost every episode we talk about the test.
Mm.
But in this case, I think it's completely appropriate. If you sit in a teacher's classroom and just count how many times they say the test, and the teacher holds the answers to the test and actually the questions too. And so there's kind of this negotiation back and forth. How much of the test are you going to release to me if we annoy you enough?
Mm.
And so there's that tension, but a teacher can really manage a class if they're saying, this is on the test, take notes, listen up. And then
Mm-hmm.
suddenly, what do your students do? They open up their notes and they're taking notes now.
Right.
But if you preface it and said, this may or may not be on the test, but I'd like you to pay attention, take down some notes if you want to. There's going to be less note taking. So it's kind of a control thing, but I would argue that the test and just the overt mention of the test creates that kind of student that the teacher deserves.
Well, for me, it's a bit of a conflict because the reason why, for example, I teach AP US history. The reason why kids take it is because they intend to take the AP test over US history at the end of the year. And so therefore, anything and everything that they do is usually for the purposes of kind of ensuring their success on the test. And so my task is how to prepare a kid for a test without constantly saying, hey, listen, this could be on the test. And it's not easy, but it is something I consciously do. You know, the idea of, so there was a time about 5 or 6 years ago where they kind of restructured parts of the AP US history curriculum by saying that, you don't have to concentrate on everything. There was a methodology that was being introduced that suggested that, you can approach a class in such a way that you give the kids a more clear idea of what to expect. But the problem is I kind of liked the lack of clarity, because it kind of fostered a different approach to the material. If I give you a textbook and I say, okay, well, I want you to read chapter 6. Okay, what am I looking for? That new kind of the new way of looking at it, the new way of looking at the test is say, okay, well, you want to look at those bold words. You want to make sure you know what those mean. You want to answer those questions at the end of the chapter, what have you. And for me, I hand them the textbook and I say, okay, I need you to read chapter 6. And they're like, okay, what am I looking for? I don't know. Why don't you figure it out? Part of it is, and it's not about being a jerk, but it's about saying, listen, you need to be able to look at some material, written material, because history is a reading subject, as I've already declared on this thing. Read this block of text, and I want you to try to extrapolate what you think is most important. Now, that's not done in isolation, because part of what I do is also teach students how to read text. And so it's not like they're just being handed something and saying, good luck to you. I hope it all works out for you. But rather, here's a text. Now, remember us talking about how you read text. And it's the idea of not trying to, because they're always looking for a shortcut. And so the shortcut is, well, you study the keywords and then you answer the questions and then Bob's your uncle. But I think part of the thing that we're trying to teach, or I'm trying to teach, is to look at it more holistically. If you stop worrying about the test and just treat the subject honestly, you're going to be where you want to be at the end of the day. But just the idea of getting the kids to come to that conclusion is hard to do.
I think what you just said applies to courses on literature as well. Um, Teachers often include a reading study guide where students, as they read, they answer questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's supposed to ensure that the student read it.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a gotcha thing, but it's also a tool to help them remember what they're reading. But the types of questions, often I've looked at my kids' work, are pretty much statements of fact, not really interpretation of the text, but names and dates to convert it to history. Real basic. Who said this? Who did that? What's the storyline? What's the plot? Nothing above that. And so that communicates the level of, I guess, the depth of that's required. And my experience is that students are going to rise as high as you want them. But if you don't encourage anything more than knowing who said what and what's the plot line, that's the level that they're going to give you.
And the question is, what is the cumulative effect of asking them these rather shallow goals and shallow expectations? What is the cumulative effect of that? And you combine that with a culture that does not encourage exposition, that does not encourage in-depth looks at anything. And then you end up dealing with a child that's not able to concentrate longer than 10 minutes on anything. The standard idea is that you never want to spend longer than 20 minutes on any one particular thing within a classroom. Mm-hmm. And that's a good idea to have. As long as it's not based on the fact that you don't think your kid can handle anything longer than 20 minutes. And for some of our kids, we're talking about maybe not 5 minutes. And so the question is that approach, the idea of saying, hey, just answer the guided reading exercise, is that an example of kind of undermining your students' ability to be able to study and to be able to stick it out and to work through stuff? Is that a problem?
I think the long-term effect is that you're going to create students who don't like to read because they don't get to have the peer experience and an open discussion, and they're trained now to give you little, I guess, chunks of things, and they, in their comfort zone, they want to know what they're looking for, like you said. Mm-hmm. And for an advanced placement course, the student wants to know that they're going to be paid twice. They want to be paid for your class to get a good grade, and they want to be paid on the AP test. Right. And if you don't have both of those, they're going to grumble and really be uncomfortable, and their impression of your subject is unfavorable because they're in that area of discomfort where they don't know why they're doing it. And what you and I would want is for them to say, well, because we love the material, we love the topic, we want you to explore this beyond this class.
Yeah, I don't get that very often. I don't get students coming up to me, Mr. Miller, I was wondering if we could just sit down here and just discuss some of the finer points of the Great Depression. We've just been arguing amongst ourselves about what is the role of government. And we thought to ourselves, this is a good venue through which to have this discussion. But
so why do you think that is? Why is that? Because it to me, it sounds like a great conversation that the students are using about 10% of your capacity. You have a wealth of knowledge. You're wonderful at asking questions. That's your gift. And pursuing it with open-ended questions that lead to maybe challenging areas. But you're still probably using about 10% of your capacity because of these implicit rules of engagement, I guess.
One of the things that I've confronted is our student, and every teacher has this, I assume, students who have come up to them and said, I'm just, or in a fit of frustration, they say this class is boring. And I was like, well, I get it could be, certainly. If I'm the only one talking, it certainly can be boring. However, there is another part of the equation I think you're missing, and that's you. What are you doing? And so I think for them, I think part of the attitude and the reason why they don't ask that kind of question, my ideal history student, is because one, maybe they don't care. Two, they're not interested. Three, they don't have time. Four, it's not in their mind, it's not relevant to dig deeper if they don't feel like they're going to be asked about this later on. Every teacher has a handful of folks every year that are those kind of students that say, please teach me more. I want to avail myself of your expertise or what have you. But the vast majority of kiddos, it's a business decision for them, Well, remember the old joke about Deion Sanders that he never tackled just because he made a business decision. It was either tackle, get hurt, or continue on making money and being a player. I think for some of these students, they're sitting there thinking to themselves, okay, business decision, I only have this much time to commit to U.S. history, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to focus on this other stuff. And so constantly, students are making these business decisions on a day in, day out basis, and that's what governs how they interact with the material.
So potentially the attention span of a student, we're really underestimating it, because in certain domains, for example, in athletics, these students are locked in and they'll work really hard, focused, and there's not a question of them, losing sight of what they're doing or why. Music is another example. I mean, students practice like crazy. There's a competitive aspect, but they also eventually love it. so that the capacity is there, but I think the difference is that in music, there's not that kind of a test necessarily.
Mhm.
And the same thing is true in athletics. I mean, there are definitely benchmarks and getting yelled at and winning and all those things, but the test is still it's not as present. It's more in the background, I guess.
Well, and with regards to athletics, the test is a much more organic type of thing. If you go on the field on a Friday night and you get your ass handed to you, then well, there's your test. You just lost. You just failed. And so it's a much more clear cut sort of thing. But I think the other thing is when you're on the athletic field or when you are in the practice room, you are removed from all the other things that typically distract a student in the course of a given class. And because you got all this other rigmarole in a class, that enhances, and not even, I could sit in a classroom and I could tell my students, put your phones away, and they'll put their phones away because, I don't have any out and out rebels but, and that's certainly not something you want to die on a hill for, is have your phone out, but they know it's there. And it's almost like they're twitching to get the opportunity to use that daggum phone. And so because I think in a classroom, we allow so much crap in there, I think it fosters a attitude of a lack of attention, a lack of intellectual stamina. You're out in the football field, you're out in the soccer pitch. It's just you, the ball, in the field. Okay. You're in the practice room. It's you, it's your instrument. It may be other folks that play the same instrument, but it does not have all this other mess. But in a classroom, the mess is just piling on. Every single year, there's more stuff in the classroom. And I wonder if that doesn't also help create that lack of attention span.
There are a lot of forces that pull a student away. I mean, you mentioned the technology, the concept of a notification means, I mean, that's a nice way of saying a bell or something that distracts you.
Right.
And it's something that you can't ignore. I mean, you can't ignore a text message. It demands your attention. But there's another thing that happens at school. And I mean, you and I were about to write a book on technology specifically, and we interviewed some students, and what we gathered early on, and this was probably 10 years ago, was that during a school day, there's a drama happening among students. And so they're communicating, with their phone, and they're talking to each other, but it's a drama that's playing itself out in real time. And it starts when they walk in the door, and it leaves. I mean, it kind of gets shaken up during lunch and passing periods, and it concludes at the end of the day and maybe even into the evening. So you're infringing on that drama by talking about history. So there are two things happening there. Their mind is not on history until you make it the case. But that drama, I wouldn't underestimate it, because that social drama for most of the students is really, really powerful.
And when we talk to those students, as you said, that was 10 years ago. I mean, you could easily say that the impulse on notifications and things of that nature have risen exponentially since we first talked to those kiddos 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And they were saying, oh, it's all going to be okay. Remember that? When the student said, it's going to be okay. And at that point, they would not, they started to not want to open up their laptop because it took too long. And
right.
So that was a sign to me, a warning, just because I know it doesn't take that long to open up a laptop and have it. But that wait time was excruciating, for a high school kid. And so they said the phone's faster. And so everything has gotten a lot faster. I mean, I don't even know if they had smartphones back then.
I think it was coming out. So.
Yeah, that's right. But the distractions and the speed of all of the information going back and forth. Do you sense it? Because I mean, when I was teaching German, I had a internal clock, particularly when I was teaching grammar. It was a 4-minute clock. I'd be talking about something that was pretty complicated, and after 4 minutes, the students would kind of glaze, and then I'd transition to, speaking German or practicing it. But sometimes you just have to get your hands dirty and explain something, where you're talking and they're listening. But has it changed over the years? Have students changed in your mind?
Well, for me, I think I see it with regards to how they handle questioning and their ability to withstand it. I remember 10 years ago, when that same group of kiddos that we're talking about, I had a discussion. I said, how does it feel to answer questions in a class? I think you remember, we had kind of created this idea of this conversation that I should have with students. And you remember one of the kids, he was a pretty smart kid, and he was pretty clever, and he was pretty engaged, and he wanted to do well. But he said that after the second question, he felt like he was being badgered. The idea of being able to withstand questions, to be able to withstand long sloughs of material or information or work or explanation or practice or what have you, is certainly being increasingly infringed upon by outside forces. Now, how they look at questions, how they look at work, or what have you. As far as the phone goes, and as far as the impact that you sense it, I sense it the most during testing. When I'm not necessarily talking about my test, but I'm talking about like when you do like a state test. Right. In Texas, it's called a STAR test, or you do like an AP exam or what have you. You can see the withdrawal symptoms beginning to emerge.
I remember that. It was painful to see.
Towards the end of the testing period. And remember, they don't allow the kids to have access to their bags, their phones, or anything like that.
Just a book, right?
Just a book.
They can have a book.
And some kids can't handle it, and they'll go to sleep. Those put their head down and say, I cannot handle reality absent of my phone. I think I'm just going to try to pass the time the quickest way I know how, and that is unconsciously. And so they go to sleep, and then when they wake up, okay, you can use your phone now. That's great. Okay, I didn't have to endure any of that time without my phone. And so you have those kids. And what's interesting is after the test, it's a very interesting phenomenon, because there's that period after the test where they can't access their bags and phones yet, but they can talk. And you always get a couple of kids that put their head down. That's the kid that can't handle it. But you also have a lot of kids that will end up talking with one another. And there'll be animated conversations, and it looks like they're having fun. And it looks like, oh, wow, they're really connecting. They're engaging with one another. And then the second you say, okay, get your phones, the conversation ends. No matter how much fun they were having, no matter how engaged they were, it comes to an end as soon as that phone is in their hand. And I think, to me, it's sad, but it also is maybe indicative of what's happening in the classroom in general. I mean, just the idea, like you said, what's happening on that phone is a damn sight more important to them and more interesting to them than what's happening in the classroom.
It's a frightening idea that they suddenly turn away from each other, at that moment. I mean, I saw something like that. I don't know how many years ago it was, not that long ago, but it was a tennis tournament at Wimbledon. And the great Roger Federer won another championship, and they have the ceremony, where they're walking around with the trophy in the stadium. But they also have a tradition where the winner goes behind the stadium, still on another balcony, and greets the public, the people who don't, can't afford to buy tickets, but are there to celebrate. And so there's Roger Federer, and he holds up his I think it's a plaque, or that round thing, and it was quiet. And I said, why aren't they cheering? What's going on? And everybody was taking pictures of him or filming him. It was silent. It was the most frightening, odd thing. But that idea that that capturing that moment is more important than being in the moment.
Well, this is one of the other things that our students lack, and again, I think they're being encouraged to dismiss it, and that is the idea of being in a moment. And we talked about it in connection with, there's certain various religious and philosophical thoughts that emphasize the notion of being in the moment, whether we're talking about Buddhism, whether we're talking about transcendentalism. I mean, the idea that there are core ideas and belief systems that say that your abilities as a person, as a human being, is dependent upon your understanding and appreciation for the moment. And once you can't do that, well, then you've got a real problem on your hands. And I think you see it in some of our students.
I talked to one of my sons about music, and I asked him if he ever listens to a whole album. I guess we used to call them albums, a CD, whatever, but a group of songs by an artist. And he said, never happens anymore. I mean, you create your playlist and you listen to those, or you listen to stations that you kind of curate. But I wonder if there's something there as far as translating that idea into the classroom, because you're kind of giving them a record, a CD of Ross Miller, Mr. Miller's
Greatest hits.
That's right, greatest hits. But they're not able to make their playlist, and that makes them nervous a little bit. You know, they don't have the remote, and also they're lacking that control. So maybe the phenomenon of sitting in a room after a state test is also what they feel to some extent in a classroom setting with a teacher teaching them.
And it also explains, and kind of that there's that, and I think it also explains the kind of reaction to that. You remember that infamous training session that we had where we were subjected to a video, and the video, I don't have a cough button, sorry about that, but it had a video showing kids saying, we do our work on iPhones now, or and it talked about meeting the kids where they were.
We text. We email.
We email.
Multitask.
We
multitask. Yeah.
And so, and of course, teachers and administrators and school leaders have bought into this. Oh my God, they text. We need to make sure that we incorporate texting or the phones or what have you into the ordinary, everyday run-of-the-mill classroom. And it is extended to what some have called a kind of a relevance-based education, that you only teach in the way that's relevant to the student. And the idea being that then they will be more engaged, and then they will be more interested, and then they will do better on tests, because now everything is about tests and how they're assessed, and more importantly, how the schools are assessed. And now everything is about that. Now, a person stepping back away from that might say, isn't the purpose of education to get away from what you know? Isn't the purpose of education to be exposed to something beyond what you know or beyond what you're comfortable with? And so I think this is like another kind of extension of a kind of a kowtowing to modern culture that schools are doing, that teachers are doing, that administrators and what have you are doing, that ultimately are doing a disservice for our students long term.
I think that all goes back to a misunderstanding with teachers and some of the professional development or learning that they've had over the years. But the idea was to hook the students with starting with their world, which is perfectly fine. And so maybe you're talking about Roman history or something, and then you you provide an example that's a modern parallel.
Okay.
But that's meant to hook the students, not meant to be the curriculum.
Right.
And so they're using the hook and thinking we need to stay there and what you're saying is no, we need to move away from the hook pretty quickly to explore some things that the student doesn't necessarily have access to through experience. Otherwise, it would be pretty damn boring,
Well, and you see it, and it's not that there was a bygone age in American education where people did not think this, but one of the things that it kind of implicitly says when it is all about the modern connections and it's all about what's important to the student is that then the student can say, this is not relevant to me. I don't plan on using this in my career, my six-figure career, which I'm going to start right after high school. This is about nothing. And so therefore it is nothing. It doesn't matter. And then, then you have the kind of question that history teachers get from time to time. Why are we studying this? I think I told the story. I had a world history class. It was and we were talking about the Mughals, the kind of a group that controlled India during 16, 1700s, I believe. And I had a kid asked me in the middle of class, why are we studying this? And my initial reaction was, who are you to say that someone is not worth studying? You've got everything figured out. You got this whole thing locked down. You don't need any extra help, you know.
That's what you said to the kid?
Well, I said an abbreviated version of that, but it did catch me off guard a little bit, and I was annoyed. And so I probably reacted with annoyance. But think about that attitude for a second. Why are we studying these people? And think about all of the mental conditions that must be in place in that kid's head to ask that question. And part of it is how we teach students how to approach the material. If it's not connected to what they're interested in, if it's not connected to the phone, if it's not connected to their preconceived notions about what they're going to do in their life, it is not relevant. And think about that. Think about the mindset that asked that question, you know? And it's shocking, and the audacity to ask that question, but just also the implication of what's going through that kid's head to ask that question.
Well, I don't think it's anything personal.
No,
but still, I think it goes back to our discussion of, this instrumental value of your class. It's used to get a grade. It's used to maybe get AP credit. It's used to affect their class ranking, ultimately to get them into school, to get them money.
right.
So your class is about money. How does that feel?
Well, I mean, that we have seen an increasing bastardization of education. As soon as it became about getting into college, then the idea of getting into college was about getting a job, and this idea of monetizing education. Now, this may seem Pollyanna, this may seem unrealistic, but good gracious, how a kid approaches a subject is going to dictate what they get from that subject. And you're telling me that a kid who is going to become some sort of engineering nerd making a gazillion dollars, he does not benefit, or she does not benefit from art, that they don't benefit from music, that they don't benefit from foreign languages, from history. Now, I'll grant you, my subject, probably more than any other subject, is a slow burn. And people don't typically come around history until they're in their 30s and 40s. So I want to put that caveat out there. But I think we do our kids a disservice by teaching them it's okay to think like this. It's okay to dismiss subjects and categorize it as either important or not important, relevant or not relevant, based upon their own personal world, their own personal experience, or what they intend to have as their personal future.
It makes me think of Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams standing on the chair, getting his students to stand up on the chair and tear out the pages.
Yes.
I hope that every teacher has that. Not don't do it, by the way. That's a terrible idea.
You're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, you would. But that they're talking about something that's transcendent, that is talking about the meaning, the joy of life. And it should be. I would feel insulted to think that the thing that you've devoted your life to, people are trivializing, and they're trying to get past your class. They're trying to pass it, never to return. So that's a battle, and then you have a lot of teachers and administrators who are really working against you also, because they're interested in the grade and the distribution of your failure rate and all these things, and how are the test scores, how are your scores. So I don't think there's anything easy about that. And being a English teacher or a history teacher, I think those are the two fields that you're dealing with some sacred ideas.
And you see it's not, and you don't just see it on the school level. You don't just see it on the district level. This whole STEM movement is based on the notion, and it started with the idea that this is where you can make real money. And somehow a person is not complete unless they go for engineering or math or science or what have you. For example, there was a very real problem some years ago that young girls did not see a future in science and mathematics because it was deemed, I don't know whether people said it implicitly or explicitly, where they got the sense that the science and the maths were not for them, that it was more about, and it should be more about literature and poetry and what have you. That was supposedly the feminine arts, I guess. And there's been a lot of efforts over the last couple of decades to say, no, you should be able to go for anything. You should be able to go for math. You can go for science. You can go for anything. But what happened is that people overcorrected. And so now any kid or any young lady who decides to go towards history, or, it's considered a failure. This, you should be going towards the math and going towards the science. That's what the whole STEM thing's about. It's not just about the idea that says everyone should have an access to math and science and a career in those fields, and they certainly should have access to it, but to suggest that that's the only viable because they pay money, because they get a better job because of it, a better paying job because of it. I think that that's where you start getting into some problematic areas. And I think that's where history and that's where language has taken a back seat. And I can't help but think it's not for the better, certainly,
The image of overcorrecting, I think that's sound, because what it does is that you kind of take away from one thing to add to another. And we have a bias, both of us, to the liberal arts.
Yes.
But, and we share a belief that getting a foundation in the liberal arts is a foundation in thinking, and also a discipline where you can accomplish other things later because you've learned to sustain attention. But the idea of STEM in high school, for example, is you're jumping ahead. The foundation isn't there yet. And you don't know how to communicate or write, and maybe you can learn it through STEM. But I would say we're jumping the gun a little bit. And a high school student, I even think that a undergraduate degree should be in the liberal arts, and then you specialize a little bit later. But we're trying to specialize really, really early, telling eighth graders, what's your career path? How the hell do they know? They're in eighth grade.
I don't know. We're looks like we're kind of like in a wrapping up period, but I would like to see a reevaluation of how we treat the humanities, and again, we have our biases, but I don't think I come to this with a bias necessarily against science or math. It's just a question that all these subjects can, one, coexist and commingle, and two, there is kind of a staggered approach that we got to have to this. First, to learn how to think, then to start thinking in ways that specialize in one area or the other. I think it's a good way of going about it, and it's why you had in years gone by, the idea of the classical liberal education, and then you moved on to something else. Then you moved on to a kind of a more focused discipline.
I think we definitely agree on that, and I'm also really happy that you seem to be riled up again, and this is good. I've said I like you better when you're a little bit grumpy, and
better when I move.
Yeah, and this conversation has kind of gotten both of us grumpy, and we'll probably talk more about STEM. We'll probably get a little bit of hate mail. Actually, we have it set where we can't get any comments, and I kind of like that on this. I'm not interested in suggestions. I'm interested in what you have to say, and hopefully a few people enjoy it.
Yes, hopefully so. Let's put a fork in this one for the time being, because like you said, there's plenty left to be said going forward. But I kind of like how we kind of ended things here with the promise of more later.
Maybe we had the final word on these topics, and no one will ever get into them again because we did such a fine job.
I don't think that's true, but who knows? We'll see how it goes. But
there we go. Well, sir, I guess I'll say goodbye first. Herr Miller.
Goodbye, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.